Hey everybody, sorry I'm a little late there. This is Matt Erpelding from the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. And today we're talking about the effects that COVID-19 and the ensuing pandemic has had on our May primary election. As you know, there have been changes so that the election is done entirely by mail. And in a moment, we're going to be joined by Ada County Clerk, Phil McGrane, to talk about the details of that and how to make sure you get your ballot and have time to adequately do your research, vote, and turn it in so that they can have the count tabulated by June 2nd. As you know, the Boise Metro Chamber is a member-driven organization, and we are highly dependent upon the support and the investments from our member organizations. And Bank of Idaho has proven to be an incredible partner. And before we start, I'd just like to play this brief message from our sponsor and supporter, Bank of Idaho.
Jeff Newgard here, President and CEO of Bank of Idaho. I hope you and your family are staying safe and healthy during these challenging times. Bank of Idaho is here for all your banking needs, and we have 3 convenient locations to serve you. Downtown Boise, Overland Road, and coming soon, a full-service branch in downtown Nampa. We believe that people bank with people. That's never been more true than now. Bank of Idaho is a proud supporter of the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. Bank of Idaho, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Well, Phil McGrane is here with us, and Phil is no stranger to elections, having worked in the Ada County Elections Office as a deputy clerk since about 2005. He's serving in his first term as Ada County Clerk, and he is, I'm sure, never thought he would be managing an election like this. So welcome, Phil. It's great to see you. Tell us about what's actually happening right now.
It's great to see you, Matt, and as well as many of the other chamber members who are tuning in. This is strange times for all of us. I'm bummed I missed the opportunity to see everyone at the leadership conference this year, given everything that's going on. So it's great to engage with the chamber and all the members, as well as especially some of those Leadership Boise alums that are out there watching as well. So thanks for being here. And it's great to be able to talk about the election. As you and I were discussing right before this, I keep referring it to as the upcoming election on May 19th, when really we are in the middle of the election right now, with people actively voting every single day here in the Valley.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what happened. So the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw nationally all of these concerns. Elections were being postponed. How did Idaho handle this election, and what's the plan moving forward?
So in terms of our election, this has been really interesting with COVID-19 and the timing. I think this isn't unique to Idaho. For every state that's been trying to address this, it really had to be timing. So right in the middle of when we were making our decisions on how our state should approach it was when Wisconsin held their primary, which was certainly one of the informative things that we saw as we were kind of preparing. There was a couple of weeks leading up to the actual decision in terms of how to change the election. And some of the biggest drivers actually came from clerks like myself, as well as clerks throughout the rest of the state, saying, hey, we're already experiencing issues. So the March 10th presidential preference primary happened right when we were all starting to hear about COVID-19 in the United States. It was in advance of the orders that we saw in this state for anything. But there was a little bit of concern. We were looking at sending out some hand sanitizer for that election. And then it was right after that things really kind of blew up, and we started having to look at how we do things differently. Some of the biggest motivators were our polling places that we normally use for an election. Many of them started saying, hey, you're not going to be voting here. We don't want people coming inside, so no voting at these locations. And then similarly, I think if most watchers kind of think about their poll workers who sit at their polls, a lot of them were not too eager to be handling the thousands of people that come and go at any given polling location. The median age of a poll worker in Ada County is 69 right now. And so that gives you an indication, with all the facts that we now know today, it wasn't set up for a very good situation. And so working with the Secretary of State, Lawrence Denny, with Governor Little, and many others, we tried to come up with what is the best way to handle this election. There were conversations about possibly delaying the election And it was kind of the balance between, do you delay and wait for a safer time to hold it, versus do we try a different method, which is what we're doing now, voting by mail. That kind of collective sense was, it's better to keep the timetable the same, and let's just try to see if we can't do this all by mail, just like Oregon, Washington, and some of our other neighbors have been doing for quite some time.
Some folks had reached out to me about the conversations about delaying the election, and it felt to me like it was a matter of flipping a coin, because you don't know what's going to happen in June or August, where the discussion to possibly delay the election to. So Idaho is it's well suited for this, because it already had absentee vote by mail as an available tool. And then but one thing that is a complication to this is one of the trademarks of Idaho's voting is same-day voter registration. So how is same-day voter registration going to be impacted by this? And do you think that will have an impact on the election numbers?
Well, first, Matt, maybe I'll answer that question, but I'd say maybe if you want to share that first slide, I'll just talk about, in case anybody doesn't know, what the process looks like for this specific election. So one of the big things is we are doing the entire election by mail. If you want to vote, the way you're going to vote is through the mail. There will be no instances where people have the opportunity to show up on election day and vote, not even at a single location in any of the given counties. So you want to make sure that you do request your ballot. Everyone needs to actually request a ballot to be mailed to them. It will not automatically happen, even though that happens in some other states. The way our primaries are structured does not lend itself to being able to just mail everyone a ballot. We've gotten that question a lot from folks. Why not just mail them all out? As you know, Matt, being involved in politics, we have choices to make in terms of which ballot you get in a primary election. And so voters need to actually tell us, do you want a Democratic ballot? Do you want a Republican ballot? Or do you want the nonpartisan ballot? And once they make that selection, then we can send it off. So there's been a real big push by the clerks, and especially the Secretary of State's office, to make everyone aware you do need to request your ballot. Those requests have to be received by Election Day, which is May 19th. The easiest way to do that is at idahovotes.gov. For this election, this is the first time we've ever had it. There is an online absentee request process. It is part of the response to this whole election. Also, every registered voter should have received a postcard last week from the Secretary of State's office with a request form on it, so that they can get their request in. And from everything we're seeing, people are becoming aware. We're seeing those requests come through. If anything, and we can talk about this a little bit more, is the volume has been crazy in terms of how many requests have been coming in. The big thing, though, is what's different about this election is Election Day is May 19th, so that's the day you have up to request your ballot. But because we're doing it through the mail, there's additional time for us to mail you your ballot, as well as additional time for you to be able to mail your ballot back in. And so we won't actually have results or do all the ballot counting until June 2nd. So every voter can return their ballot up to June 2nd at 8 p.m. All ballots in hand at that point will be the ones that are counted, and then we'll have the final results that evening, which just you can kind of see from this slide, makes the process a little bit different. Normally, the last day to get a ballot is also the last day to return a ballot. In this instance, they're separated by a little bit.
So to your point, I can go to idahovotes.gov, I can register to vote, and I can request my absentee ballot up to May 19th. So same-day registration still applies. There's just a delay in receiving and returning the ballot to June 2nd.
Exactly. And actually, one of the biggest motivations, there were a couple different manifestations of this that were discussed. But because we're a state with same-day registration, as you asked earlier, that's why we did it the way we've did, is so that people could still update their registration and register on Election Day. We actually have some federal exemptions from other laws that are really important that we wanted to be able to maintain. So we wanted to be able to maintain that unique quality that we have of same-day registration. So anyone can, normally, as you know, there's a cutoff prior to an election. There's no cutoff for registration this election. You can register online and then make your absentee request online all the way up to May 19th. And then just make sure everybody, if you have a ballot now or you get a ballot later, to make sure to get it back to us by June 2nd.
Great. So before we move on to the other slides, maybe briefly tell us a little bit about, there's this myth out there. There's a number of myths around absentee voting. The first myth is that one party or the other will receive a subtle advantage as a result of absentee ballot measures. And the other myth is that there's a high level of fraud in absentee voting. Talk a little bit about those two things and kind of debunk those myths a little bit.
Sure. It's interesting in terms of the party advantage. You'll hear that, and I'm going to guess it depends on what state you're in terms of who is the one saying that there's a partisan advantage to that. Certainly on the national level, we've seen the president either tweet out or make comments regarding this, but it really is driven by what is the representation in that community. So frequently we've seen absentees favor Republicans in the state of Idaho, and it's largely because there's a lot of Republicans. It's not a strategy or anything to do with the process. It happens to be whoever the largest body of your voters are, or also who is leading the charge in terms of campaigning in that method. I'll say on a typical election, which this one is certainly not, the largest driver of absentee voting is the political parties themselves. They will send out request forms encouraging their members to participate by mail, because that's one way that the parties know they can track who is voting and making sure they get their people out, kind of get out the vote efforts. Those are usually what drive the greatest participation, and it ebbs from election to election which party does the biggest efforts that way. But that's where we see is the candidates and the parties kind of pushing things. And so there isn't, right now when we look at the stats for this election as well, there's enough participation that it actually pretty well reflects the representation in the state. So the number of registered Republicans versus the number of registered Democrats, we're seeing requests relatively mirror the overall general population. And I think that holds true throughout the United States. It's one of these things, just I think sometimes it's sore losers looking for a reason, kind of to blame an election, but it's pretty representative of the whole process. The other question that you mentioned is voter fraud. In all the methods that we have to vote, we have security measures in place. And I want to reassure people that we do prosecute voter fraud in Ada County when it comes up nationally as well as locally. It's very rare, but it does happen where we see people try to vote twice, and we will pursue that. One of the particular safeguards that surprises people the most when it comes to absentee voting is we actually check the signature on every single ballot that comes in. So if we get 80,000 ballots coming in, we will check 80,000 signatures. We have a really slick system in our voter registrations, in the voter registration system we use, where when you get that absentee ballot back, if everyone thinks about their ballot, and I think you've got yours, Matt.
I do. I've got mine right here.
Yeah, there on the back of the envelope there, the return envelope is an affidavit for you to sign when you're returning it. So first of all, if you don't sign it, it's not valid. But when you sign it, I'm actually able to use that barcode that's on there or use some of the other information to look you up, and instantly your signature from your registration card when you originally registered will pop up, so I can compare that signature to what's on your envelope. And we use that for a couple of things. One, just to make sure it's valid. And if we ever have any issues, which usually the issues are not voter fraud related, what we typically see is people forget to sign, or a couple in a house, they will each sign the other person's ballot, right? And so we see it. And so in those moments, what we'll do is we'll actually take steps to correct it. We'll try to give the voter the opportunity to still have their vote counted. And so we'll reach out and call and say, hey, you forgot to sign it, or there's an issue, and they can come remedy it. Similarly, those calls, if say a signature doesn't match, we call to say, hey, has something changed? We have people who registered to vote 40 years ago, right, and their signatures may have evolved in that period of time. And so we'll contact them to validate that it is the person and try to get them to update their signature on the registration card, as well as that's the opportunity for a voter to say, I didn't return a ballot. What are you talking about? Right, which triggers us to work with law enforcement to pursue any sort of voter fraud. But it's very rare. Normally, if we see voter fraud is a broad term here. We don't usually see people really intentionally trying to change the outcomes so much as, a recent one in memory I have is someone was a property owner and they lived in Mountain Home and owned property there. They also had a rental in Meridian, and they wanted to vote on their taxes being raised there, so they same-day registered. In our systems, there's lots of safeguards. So the second somebody does that, it pops up and it says, hey, you voted twice. And that gives us the chance to communicate, not just within Ada County, but across all the counties, making sure that we're maintaining the security of the elections.
That's great. So how is turnout right now?
So yeah, if we can pull up that slide, I'll show you, like, it's fascinating to see how this election stacks up to others. I'm gonna switch slides here. Let's see, get this video to play. This is a comparison. It's a race between past elections. Those yellow elections are general elections, mostly either presidential or gubernatorial elections. And this is showing day to day what the absentee requests look like. That top green bar is the absentee request for this specific election. And as you watch this, it just shows how unprecedented this really is. The next highest is the 2012 presidential election. That's the second place slot. So you can see just how many absentee requests have come through, and we still have quite a few days to go before the election. What this doesn't reflect at the moment is at the end of the week last week, I think it was on either Friday or Saturday, we received 16,000 additional requests coming in the mail from the postcard the Secretary of State had sent. Yeah. So we're slammed trying to get
you're going to be over 100,000 probably.
We probably are. At the rate we're moving, we'll be over it. And to put that into comparison, so if we hit, heck, even where we are right now at 76,000 requests that have gone out, to put this into comparison, 4 years ago, which we always compare on a 4-year cycle basis, 4 years ago for this primary, Ada County only voted 35,000 people total. That's combined early, absentee, and election day, 35,000. We are already more than double that for this election. And what makes it really interesting is there's really nothing different about this election than that election other than the COVID-19 response. Both don't have any hot, presidential, gubernatorial, or other top ticket races. And so normally that's where we see turnout being driven by. In this case, it's a pretty normal primary election with a lot of legislative races, which I'm sure you can relate to.
Right.
Heck, I think it's your old district that is having one of the hottest races in the state, as a matter of fact.
Yes, there's a big primary here. There's a number of big primaries this year, which you would think would drive some outcomes, or some of the increase, but that much increase can't be attributed to the different primaries around the valley.
No, definitely not. Early on, it was interesting. What we saw is the first people who requested their absentee ballots, for the politicos who might be watching, those were your 404 and 304 voters, the people who had the highest propensity to vote in a primary election. Coincidentally, were also the very first people to request their absentee ballots because they're in tune with the elections, in tune with the process. But now we're definitely reaching into less frequent primary voters. So most of the voters we're seeing are probably people who always vote in a general election or a presidential election. But now, due to the extra attention that this election is getting, more people are showing up and participating. I think the thing that we're now watching is just our return rate to see how many ballots actually come back, because there will certainly be some voters who get a ballot. There aren't either very many contested races on it, or they just don't recognize the people. And so it'll be interesting to see if voters can find the information and make informed decisions and get their ballots back to us.
Nice. So how's the return rate going? So I've got my ballot, and you're going to get a postcard from my wife that she's turning hers in today. So you're going to see a ton more this week, but how many people that have requested them are actually turning them back in?
So far, we've had 35% of them come back, which is pretty typical. We actually track, that's one of the stats that we track to make sure there's no anomalies for an election. We're right on path with all prior primaries. One of the interesting things is most voters, even if they got their ballot, 3 weeks ago, it's pretty common for voters to hold on to their ballots for a while. They either want to see how the campaigns play out. More media information comes out closer to election day than it does early on. And so it gives voters a chance to be informed and then to make their decisions. So we always see a spike as we get closer to election day. I'm not quite certain how the extra 2 weeks on the back end will affect this election by giving voters that extra time. We'll certainly be out there encouraging voters to get them back. One of the interesting things we see about returns is we always get less ballots back as a percentage in primary elections than we do in general elections. General elections have really high return rates, and I think that's typically because the governor and the president are on the ballots. But we still got a ways to go. We'll expect it to get up to 80% or greater by the end of this process, and so we'll be watching that throughout.
Can you compare this to some historical participation? I think you've got a graph that kind of speaks to that on your next slide.
Yeah, let me share the next slide. So this is just, some of this information I think is just, I enjoy sharing it to show people what's going on with our elections, especially for those who are super engaged, which if you're probably willing to live stream a chat about elections, you're more engaged than many. That's just by the nature of it. This graph is really interesting in the sense it's comparing historical participation in the state of Idaho as it reflects of voting age population. That's different than registered voters. Voting age population includes those people who are old enough and able to register to vote, but just choose not to register to vote. There is a contingent, and actually we slowly see that growing. So you can kind of see the downward trend. It's interesting to look at the 2018 gubernatorial election because there was a big spike. It was a big election for this state, and so you can see that spike in participation.
Right.
But we can kind of see how it ebbs and flows. In terms of primary elections, this one is certainly going to stand out as probably one of the highest in, probably over time, one of the highest participation just because of all the attention. It's almost too bad all elections don't get this kind of attention because we'd probably see greater participation overall. And for all the work that our office does, we'd love to see people take advantage of the opportunity to vote.
So is there a higher propensity that young people will participate in absentee voting, or does it still skew toward a more established population?
That's a very eloquent way to say that, a more established population. Actually, it's just the opposite. Absentee voting generally favors those who are older on any given election. This might be a little bit different just because everybody's having to request it this way. As we get closer to Election Day, we did this in 2018. We'll actually start to share the top 10 and bottom 10 first names in terms of who's requested their ballots. It's a fun way for us just to see engagement. And if I share kind of what happened in the 2018 election, so for the general election in 2018, Matt, do you want to take a guess as to what the #1 first name was for voting prior to Election Day, that election?
John.
That's a good guess. I think a lot of people might even guess Matt, right? Common names like that. First of all, you should know that that was a bad guess. This is the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And I can tell you just as a tip, women always outvote men almost across the board. So just by the fact that you guessed a male's name shows you weren't on the right track. Interestingly enough, that election, it was a battle between Doris and Phyllis.
Wow.
Top names. When we shared it, it was great to see the top 10 names were what many people might refer to as grandmother names, right? Just older names. And then the bottom 10 were all what people would call millennial names, right? And it was kind of funny to get to see how those names changed over time. And we'll be doing that again for this election because it's kind of well set for that as we get a little closer to Election Day.
Well, and that kind of speaks to those 2018 participation numbers by age that you have in your slide that's coming up here.
Yep.
And this part is kind of a heartbreaker to me because it seems to me that 18 to 29 is such a potentially powerful group. And at the very top, you can see that 200,000 of them aren't even registered to vote, which is really tough to see.
Yeah, so for those who are just seeing this for the first time, the different colors, so the bluish green represents people who voted in the 2018 general election. The yellow orange color represents people who were registered to vote but did not vote during that election. And then the red represents people who are eligible to register to vote but haven't even registered. And you can see it by age breakdown. The youngest voters, so that 18 to 29 group hardly votes at all. I wrote op-ed 4 years ago using some of this information, and I titled it "Young People Don't Vote," but I defined young people as those 59 and below. And the reason here is you can see it's not until you hit the 60s and above that more than 50% of the voting age population actually exercises their right to vote. So it's no wonder why groups like AARP and others have such strong influence in our politics when you look at who are the ones showing up to the polls. So even though 30 to 44 is the largest group of people,
right,
kind of our generation, right, Matt?
Right.
When you look at participation, most of our peers are not taking the time to exercise their rights. And so it's an unfortunate trend, and it'll be interesting to see as we go over time. You know, there's a lot of people who think that once you start working, once you start paying taxes, that you're more inclined to vote because you have something at stake. But we're just not seeing that with this generation,
right,
in terms of participation. And so who knows if something like COVID-19 might be the catalyst to get people engaged. I think only time will tell.
Do you have any breakdowns yet of the age groups that have requested ballots, or is that yet to come?
We have all that information. I haven't dialed into it. We're tracking like party participation and some other things. But we do have the information, and maybe that's something we can put together to share out with everybody on social media, just because it's interesting to see who's actually taking advantage of the unique election here.
Right. So there's just some other historical information you have with regard to the trends that Idaho has had in presidential elections. And so talk to that a little bit, because that adds to this dispelling of the myth that absentee ballots will somehow give one party or another advantage, as much as the fact is that over history, Idaho has been trending in a certain direction, and that trend doesn't appear to be changing.
Yeah, despite your best efforts, I think that seems true.
I worked real hard.
Here are kind of two different variations. So for those wondering, you know, who is likely to prevail in the presidential election in November. So this is looking at the November elections. Each of these represents the state of Idaho. So you can see back there, the very first state of Idaho is 1992, where the Panhandle actually very heavily leaned towards the Democratic Party back then. Which is interesting to see today. You and I, being engaged in politics, would definitely know the Panhandle is not known for its Democratic leanings these days. If anything, it's swung very far the other direction. Sorry, what was that, Matt?
I said things have changed up there.
Yeah, things have changed a lot up there, especially with all the people migrating into our state. But you can kind of see, you know, Blaine County stands out there in the center. And you can see kind of where this trends. I don't think, you know, the next one is I think even more interesting to see. And to your point before, our absentee requests for this election as a state are going to be Republican leaning, because this is a Republican leaning state. I'm certain if we were in Hawaii looking at the same thing, it would be very Democratic leaning, because Hawaii is kind of our counter in terms of very Democratic leaning state. This next one, I think, is the more interesting, especially for those who follow the legislature. This is the same map, but this is for the gubernatorial elections. And if you look back to 1990, I don't think most people today realize how split it was. Not that, you know, it's been quite a while, but at the same time, it's not going that far back. It's just certainly in many people's lifetime. Is back in 1990 as well, the legislature was split 50-50 in terms of party representation. And so you can just see how it has trended. And there's a lot more activity in the gubernatorial years as a state than there is in the presidential years, which I think is interesting just to see how our community's politics are more nuanced when it's localized, but less nuanced when it comes to the national level. And I think that's just one of, you know, kind of the interesting things about our election process.
Our state continues to kind of trend in that direction, and while there are changes in certain areas, it's certainly the map and the trends have been consistent since I arrived here in 1994, which was the first election that I remember in Idaho.
Sure.
So as we come up, what are the things that you want people to know about this election? I mean, this is a really important election. It obviously has a lot of changes. And the reason that we're doing this video is to really make sure we get the word out there beyond the work that you're already doing, which has been incredible on behalf of Ada County, the work that Secretary of State Denny is doing to make sure that people get their cards in the mail. But we need people to get their ballots. So what do you want people to take away?
There's a couple of things. So first and foremost is just that I would say it's kind of the obvious stuff. If you haven't requested your ballot, make sure to go to idahovotes.gov and request your ballot. Once you get it, I mean, we're into May now. Make sure you vote it and get it back to us. And I would encourage you to do it well before June 2nd. Don't wait till the last minute. It's better to be safe than sorry. So request your ballot and get it into us. A couple of things, though, with this election is there may be a little bit of a delay. So when you request your ballot, or if let's say you requested one last week, typically we get ballots to people within 5 to 7 days from when they requested it. This election, as we watch that one slide, the volume, and it's not just Ada County, it's all the clerk's offices throughout the state are just overwhelmed. Other states do big mail operations, but they've got the infrastructure and the logistics built for that. We, as I would say, had about 2 days notice to get all this in place. And as a result, it's been a massive, massive undertaking. I really can't stress enough how big of an undertaking it has been for us to switch. I think with that too, I want people to have confidence in this election. So as much as I don't want to speak to it, I think it's safe to say we've had some errors in the election this go around, where we've had to reissue some ballots to folks. Don't worry. Not just whether you're one of those people, others. We've reissued, so anybody where there was an issue, we've given them a new ballot so they can get it counted. But we also have processes in place. So say it's the ballot with the error is the only one that comes back, those votes will still be counted. We are working really hard to make sure everyone's votes count, and as well as that everyone's vote only counts once. So we've got all sorts of processes in place. So even those people where we issued 2 ballots, I can assure everybody only one of those ballots will be counted. We've got everything worked out. It's just been a massive undertaking. And I think for especially those 16,000, like I mentioned, that have just come in, it'll take us a week and a half to get the ballots to the voters. But that's why the governor and others built in that additional 2-week time frame to ensure there's ample time for people to get a ballot and get it back to us. The postage is covered for this election, so it's prepaid postage on everything. So we've tried to make it as easy as possible for all the voters to be able to cast their vote. So don't miss the opportunity. A lot has been put in place to make sure you have the opportunity to vote, so take advantage of that for this election. And then the other question you haven't asked, Matt, is what does this mean for the November election? And in all honesty, I don't know. And I say that sincerely because I think we have to get through this election and see how smoothly does this election go. What happens after the election? I think you can probably intuit as well as I can. If we have any close races, this election is very open to challenge just because it is different. Not because anything's wrong, but it's just different. And so we'll be working through that. And I don't think it's until we're on the back end that we'll be able to say, what is Idaho going to think about November? Let's assume that cases increase, or just to see voter comfort as well as we get towards November. What does this mean? I think about the only thing we know is the date is probably not moving. It requires an actual act of Congress. And so the one thing we know is when we get to the first Tuesday in November, we will all be voting then. It's just a matter of how will we be voting come that election.
That's great. And you expect the results from your office sometime into the wee hours of the morning on June 2nd, or do you think you'll be done a little earlier this time around?
I'm pretty confident we'll be done well before midnight on June 2nd. It'll probably be in the 10 to 11 range, but we'll see. Hopefully, one thing that's unique about the absentees is we will actually be counting ballots during the day on June 2nd, all throughout the day. So this actually opens up a bigger window for us to get many of the ballots counted in advance. So it's only those that come in at the last minute that we'll be waiting for, unlike a typical election where most of the ballots are coming back in on election night.
Well, I can tell you, I am really glad that I don't have to campaign in this type of an environment because, the candidates can't really knock on doors, so they have the inability to introduce themselves personally. It's much harder for them to hold house parties and other things. So I'm just glad I'm not a candidate this year, and I'm sure you are as well.
I'm always glad when I'm not a candidate, just because you know how much work that is.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to serve, and I think it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. But it's a ton of work under normal circumstances, and I can definitely attest to having talked to lots of candidates throughout this election. It's been a big shift in terms of, just like you mentioned, not being able to knock doors, but also learning the technology and other things. Kind of the people who are sophisticated, this was an easy pivot. It kind of, they just amped up part of their strategy. But for most candidates, this is the moon. This is all new, and so they're trying to understand it. Things like the return rates, how the absentees work. We're getting a lot of just kind of questions about the process, more than we normally would in any given election.
Well, Ada County Clerk Phil McGrane, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. If you want, I know you've got one more slide that you can.
Yeah, I can share my contact information with folks.
And I got to be honest, I really appreciate you taking the time to give us the historical aspects and just talk about how important this election is and how hard your office is working to make sure that we have a free and fair election, even in the midst of a pandemic. So thank you so much for joining us. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Bank of Idaho, and get out and vote.
Yeah, please do. Thank you, Matt. Thank you to the Chamber for setting up these opportunities to get people engaged.
Absolutely. We'll see you all soon.